Welcome to the VMware Multi-Cloud Podcast. My name is Eric Nielsen, and with me today, I have my co-host, David Jasso. Today, we're going to be talking about VMware Cloud Foundation and basically the state of VMware Cloud. So, David, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Eric.
Fantastic. So on the show today, we have Lee Caswell. So, David, why don't you introduce Lee, and we'll get going.
Sure. Thank you. Hey, Lee. Great to have you here today. Fun to have you and catch up on VMware Cloud Foundation and sort of how you see the marketplace. Why don't you, tell us about yourself, give us some background both at VMware and things you did before, and then we'll pick up from there.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you so much for having me on the show. We were just talking about how you're getting famous, right? As people are really looking for new sources of information. And, this is just a great way to kind of level set on the rapid change of innovation happening at VMware. So my responsibilities, VP Marketing across vSphere, our flagship product, vSAN, as many know, now just past 30,000 customers, adding 100 customers a week. And then VMware Cloud Foundation, right? The full integrated stack. On-premises as VCF, it's also the underpinnings of the architecture we have across all of our hyperscaler and our VCPP partners. So yeah, it's been a great 4.5 years here. Before this, I came in through a long line of flash companies, including NetApp from the storage standpoint, Fusion.io, many will remember. And then, interestingly enough, this is my second time here at VMware. I was here back in 2002 launching ESXi. And so great to see the pace of innovation unchanged, and look forward to talking to you more about how it's being deployed today.
Cool. Hey, you and I had a chance to sit down and chat the other day, and we were talking about, kind of what's interesting, what's happening. Maybe we can start off with some of the observations you've had, around, what other industry leaders have said around what's happening, and then talk about your point of view of what it means from thinking about cloud on premise and then taking that into the public cloud, those kinds of things. But maybe some background there. There was some interesting things you'd been following from Microsoft and Pat Gelsinger, our prior CIO. Maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, I thought one of the interesting things that Satya Nadella said recently is that we've reached the maximum consolidation we're going to see. In other words, the industry goes through cycles of pulling things together and then breaking them apart, as all know, right? From a client server day, in storage, we saw this with integrated scale-up systems breaking apart into scale-out systems like hyperconverged, for example. And I think we're seeing the same thing now, where if the original thought was things were going to go like all the way into the into the public cloud, what we thought to be true and is turning out to be true is the distributed hybrid model is what's going to exist. Now, Pat actually did allude to this in his 3 laws that he talked about, which was basically the laws of physics, the laws of economics, and the laws of the land, right? And basically what that meant was you can't afford latency to get to the storage for every data and data transaction. Right. It just means that you can't go all the way to the cloud, right, for everything coming back. And so you're going to want these distributed environments. As we all know, if anybody who's tried to send just a movie file around, right, it takes time, latency, it's not fast or free. So I think that dynamic that we have, this distributed hybrid cloud, is really what we think is the end case or the end goal for many customers. And VMware actually has a very interesting strategy to make that possible.
Cool. And so he said law of the land. I think that got to some of these issues around what we're seeing with how data sovereignty rules, data privacy, all those kinds of things. And then law of economics, you talked about physics. Maybe you can expand on law of economics as well, and law of the land.
So, any economist will tell you that there's always a premium you pay to rent other than to own, right? If you think about it, right? Now, at the same point, though, you don't want to own everything. And what we're finding is it's increasingly, you're looking carefully at things you can rent. And it turns out a lot of things are capable because of the distributed, because of the internet, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and compute is one of those really interesting areas, right? And so thinking about how I can spin things up and spin them down, right, gives you the flexibility. It's a little bit like, if you think about when do you use Uber and when don't you use Uber? All right. So if you travel to Philadelphia and you're going to be there for a couple of days, well, you'll rent something because guess what? You don't want to buy something, right? You don't need it for that point. And there's transaction costs, right? So you'll rent it, right? Because it's transactional. At the same time, at home, for many of us, right? I mean, you don't use Uber every day. Why? Well, because you know how to drive. You know you're going to be driving. Well, these times a little bit more less than some.
Sometimes.
And for most cases, right, parking is free, but you start making this calculation, right?
Right.
And what we're finding, right, is it's actually interesting to watch us now disaggregate even different types of compute. I'll give you an example. DR, right? Disaster recovery is one of those elements where you actually only want to fire up the servers on an event. You don't want them sitting powered all the time. And yet that's what many customers have done in the past. They've had a secondary dedicated data center. In New York, for example, it would be across the river, right? Sitting in Jersey, right? And these were like empty buildings, but full of CPUs, storage, networking, right? And so the idea was, listen, what you really want to do is you want to make sure the data is protected. And then you want to basically spin up compute on an instance or to be able to test. And this is a really interesting area to think about the cloud. And our new VCDR offering, for example, this is VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, allows you to take your on-prem infrastructure and respond to a ransomware attack in 5 days. Why is that? Well, because we're actually now deploying the cloud, giving you the rentability of the cloud when you need it, and making sure that your data is there ready for failover. So it's these types of integrated, innovative thinking that's helping customers determine what's the most cost-effective way to deploy VMware across their hybrid cloud.
Cool. So we've talked about the 3 laws, and I think what takeaway when we're discussing this, you wind up sort of with this notion of it's a distributed world, right? You have to sort of optimize across where you put things and what goes into the cloud and also what's on premise or on the edge. One of the things that we talk a lot about VMware, we've in the last few years talked about how we can provide a path to all the hyperscalers and all of our partners. We've talked less around sort of how we're transforming what's happening on premise. Maybe talk a little bit about what this cloud stack has meant for folks that are running still running the data center and looking to transform how they operate there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to look at parallels and also differences between the public cloud and what's happening on-prem. So some of the parallels are that, in the public cloud, it runs on servers, right? Servers are really the underpinnings of a scale-out system, right? At very large scale with a commodity hardware underpinning. And similarly on-prem, right? If you looked at hyperconverged, for example, and our ability to take virtualized compute and storage and SDN or software-defined networking and putting those on top of servers, right? You get this seamless scale-out model and x86 cost economics, right? So a lot of similarities there, but there's a difference, right? In the public cloud or hyperscaler world, you have such large scale, right, that it actually makes sense to go specialize. And so I'll give you in the storage world, right? You specialize not just on like, hey, here's storage and it's independent than compute, but you'll specialize down to, hey, here's an object store, S3, for example, or here's a block store, EBS, or here's a file store, EFS, right, in the AWS environments. And similarly, actually at large applications like YouTube, you'll have application-specific infrastructure designed for a specific app, right? Mm-hmm. On the on-prem world, it's almost invariably the opposite. What you have is mixed workloads of all different types. And you're trying to go and scale those mixed workloads and be able to manage those across like a common operational IT team that you're trying to keep as focused and simple as, or, as contained as possible. So what you have now is VMware is helping you manage this distributed, incredible scale of workloads. All the way from file-intensive systems up into CPU-intensive systems, in-memory databases like SAP HANA. And you can manage all of those with the same user interface, right, that the vSphere administrator is now investment protected across those. Most of these systems are flash, so you can support the performance needs. And finally, the really interesting part, I think, is that you can now investment protect for whatever cloud, multi-cloud that you want to go and operate in the future, because we have the same stack running across both sides of the wire. And so you can take an application that's running on-prem and now be sure that you can go and migrate it, re-platform it, repurpose. I mean, you could put it across the hybrid cloud and manage it with the same integrated model you have on-prem.
That's cool. For the economic standpoint, I think there's been innovation going on there in terms of like how you do the cloud on premise, right? So there's been a focus on lately in a lot of talk around local cloud. Maybe you can talk about sort of what some of the options are there for people when they're doing things on premise and they want to bring cloud into the environment, and what some of the options are for folks thinking about making that simpler.
Yeah, I mean, cloud is probably one of the most misunderstood words in the industry. And if you remember Web 2.0, remember that, right? Like all of a sudden it became everything to all people, right? And so, cloud in my version, you just change the letters, right? It's could. What could you do, right? So what you could do, right, in a private cloud is it means you can basically deploy seamlessly and change things flexibly without having to change physical attributes. Mm-hmm. That's a really important aspect. And right, what VMware has offered, and a lot of people don't quite grok this, is that when you want to organize today, you have to organize around the part of your business that's changing the fastest. Mm-hmm. And it used to be like, hey, there's a change in server architecture. We've got like new Intel CPUs, AMD CPUs coming out, and sure, there'll be buying cycles based on that. But what people are really trying to do is they're trying to accommodate the fastest changing part, which is the applications. That's what's changing the fastest. So when the applications are changing this fast, you have to be able to say, hey, listen, if someone, for example, decides I'm going to go launch a new application this quarter, right, to go and give me some competitive advantage, how do I go and make sure that infrastructure can change at the pace of the applications? That's what we mean when you go from a VM-centric view or even container-centric view today. And I can now say, there's new applications. They have these characteristics. I'll apply this much CPU, RAM, capacity, IOPS, QoS. I'll do it all from the VM and be able to populate it across my private cloud and even be able to transcend that into the public cloud. That's leverage, right? That's operating leverage. And that's what's getting customers excited today about the VMware Cloud.
So Lee, it is fascinating what you've just taken us through, because in a real sense, it's about the usage pattern, right? And then the three laws that Pat brought to the table, which is, economics play into it, the physicality of the data and the physicality of the application. So when you're looking at these apps, you basically have to look, and then apps are spinning up, spinning down, and you don't have, I think, time to deal with, on-prem, off-prem, and a different structure across all these. Just having that single structure that then can be dynamic and allow you to dial up or down depending on what the app needs, right? It's kind of like, yep, I don't rent shovel. I have a shovel in my backyard, but if I want a tractor, I'm going to go down and rent it because the usage pattern is just so much different. That's the economic piece, right? So it is fascinating that as the cloud matures, right, and this new model matures, that the application dictates kind of the, what the needs are, the physical needs. Economics is always playing a part, and then you can, but having that common infrastructure below it all allows you just to deal with the realities of those three paradigms.
Listen, I remember debating back in the mid 2000s, right, around the hypervisor becoming a commodity. Remember this discussion, right?
Yeah, sure.
All right, and so you're like, and there was the Hyper-V threat, right? There's KVM, certainly from an open source standpoint, and other folks have looked to go and bring hypervisors in. But here's what I suggest, right? We've never seen so much pace of change happening below the hypervisor. So new CPUs coming on board, right? New memory types. We've got flash, of course, but persistent memory, right? NVMe over fabric, right? From a storage standpoint. RDMA, right? Coming from a networking standpoint. And then even SmartNICs, by the way, and DPUs, right? Which we've announced project, Monterey, right? But then also on top of the hypervisor, right? The applications have been changing dramatically here as well, right? And so bringing in containers, right, where we've assimilated them with the same intrinsic security, the same management model, right, with integrated Kubernetes, right, as part of vSphere with Tanzu. And then finally, right, new applications, including our work with NVIDIA, So if you think about like AI, ML, right? Listen, everyone wants access to the VMware customer base. Why? Because we have the biggest, most robust customers, but also customers at scale, right? Over 300,000 customers running vSphere, for example. And so what we've done by innovating in the hypervisor and continued innovation, and then extending that to the full stack, means we're allowing customers just consolidate management. Right? You were running VMs, now you can run containers. Awesome, great. You were running on-prem, you can extend into the hybrid cloud. You were running traditional VMs or traditional applications, and now we're taking AI applications with GPUs, right? Shared, embedded, supported by NVIDIA. Like, that's an incredible amount of value for customers to figure out how do they do more with the same amount of management.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Reducing the complexity. David?
Yeah, and that's great stuff. You hit on something, and maybe we just sort of look at it from just slightly different view, which is we've been talking a lot about this idea of the right sort of the right cloud platform for any kind of cloud environment, and also for any kind of app. And I think I look back and we started with our sort of extending to. First, for VMware Cloud on AWS was sort of the first, big candidate in that. But then you mentioned Project Pacific, not necessarily by name, but talked about what we did there, which is sort of extending and in focusing on Kubernetes and having a single model across that. And then Project Monterey. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of innovation and keeping up with innovation, because you hit on it, but maybe we can just take another walk across it in terms of how much innovation we're doing down at the platform level, particularly around infrastructure, which is, I think you just you walk through some of that, but maybe we could just revisit it to just put a sharper point on it.
Well, at VMware, projects become products. Is the way that
that's awesome.
Things evolve, right? Yeah. So, we had Project Pacific, right? Was the idea, and Pacific was designed like the ocean to be broad, right? Mm-hmm. And the broad concept was that containers were adding complementary value to VMs. VMs were about managing infrastructure at scale resiliently, and containers were about the speed of development. And so here we had many, containers being run in VMs anyway, but the idea of having integrated Kubernetes support, I always alert people, like, look carefully at what we integrate into the hypervisor, because these are the things we believe will benefit most from resource efficiency, performance, right? Even at the risk of elegant design, like into the hypervisor, which is not easy, by the way. So designing in this way allowed us with Project Pacific to then launch the Tanzu portfolio. Mm-hmm. Right, and Tanzu meaning root or branch or container, depending on what language you're looking at. Basically, then extended our management model into what we call modern or container-based Kubernetes orchestrated applications. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's kind of step one. We announced the project 2 years ago. Announced products within a year, right, at VMworld. And similarly, this past year we announced Project Monterey. Now, Monterey, like the canyon, is deep. Right now we're going deep. And when you go deep, what we're looking at is, how do you now think about the next generation of applications and how they will run? And we took a couple of interesting notes here. Number one is that CPU cycles are relatively scarce today because of the slowdown in Moore's law. Mm-hmm. Similarly, or at the same time, concurrently, the CPU cycles are increasingly being demanded to do more and more non-compute things, including, by the way, some of our stuff, right? So ESXi, right? Mm-hmm. vSAN, you start looking at the networking stack. And so what we started looking at was, what was called either a smart NIC. Now, smart NIC isn't actually technically correct in my view, because a NIC is subservient to the CPU. And that's not what we're talking about. These are largely ARM-based offload engines, but they're acting as a data processing unit, or a DPU, where that DPU then is actually at a similar level, right? You've got now GPUs, DPUs, and CPUs, but they're all acting interrelated. But this new DPU architecture, called Project Monterey for us, which will evolve into products, probably check in VMworld would be a good time to see what we're up to, would be to now start thinking about how can we offload those relatively scarce CPU cycles so the CPU can do more actual application processing, and we can introduce some really new cool management elements. So I'll give you three to think about. One is secure boot, particularly important in these days, right? Around secure boot from the offload engine. Number two would be a distributed firewall. Think about a distributed firewall where east-west traffic is now increasingly dominating the amount of traffic, even for north-south traffic. And so that's second. And then third, this will be the first time that VMware can extend our management domain into bare metal, right? Because you'd have bare metal environments running on the central CPU. So in essence, you start to see here's the innovation, and we're working with key partners, right? We mentioned, NVIDIA, Pensando, Intel are three of the early development partners, along with supporting work from Dell, of course, right, on the server side, HPE, and Lenovo.
Cool. Yeah, it's amazing how much innovation is happening down, as you said, sort of below that line that people don't tend to think about, but it's just an incredibly active area.
Yeah.
The one thing we've also been working with providers like Dell to bring sort of a simplified management approach to the data center, right? With things like VMware Cloud on Dell EMC, right? So maybe talk a little bit about those models and how they fit into the picture.
Yeah. So here's I have a little Rosetta Stone around how to figure out VMware naming, which can be a little bit confusing at times. And so in our cloud portfolio,
just a little bit,
sometimes, right? So, whoever's name goes first is who's managing the service. So if you think VMware Cloud on AWS being managed by VMware, and that's why VMware, started there. Our, highest value is there, right? Because that's a VMware portal, VMware managed, right? And similarly, the VMware Cloud on Dell EMC, VMC on Dell EMC, is now that same cloud experience now delivered on-prem, but managed by VMware. Importantly, right? Very so cool. The management aspect, right? And so this is for customers who are trying to get out of some of the day-to-day IT operationals routine. Why? Well, because they're trying to spend more time managing applications. Right? I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to free up people to do what they're increasingly being valued on at the end of the day. Every business is now a software business. Competitive differentiation is based on getting a new app out. So if you can get the infrastructure the heck out of the way, now all of a sudden you can focus on that. So in any event, right, that's how that. Now, we are also partnered, and we have customers with, very important projects on Azure, for example, where we have our Azure VMware solutions managed by Azure, right? In that case, right? Or Google Cloud, right? You get Google Cloud VMware engine, right? You can see is it managed by Google. And so, that gives you an idea of how we're working to make sure that customers they have some pretty interesting choices ahead of them, right? And what I like about VMware strategy is we're giving customers the freedom to exercise the degrees of freedom they want in the future, even if they don't know precisely what they need now. And this is important, right? So for our 300,000 customers, many are using containers, some are not, but if they want to, it's fully there, investment protected. Some are integrated with the cloud. Some have independent shadow IT things working on the cloud. But to the extent that they want to go and develop an integrated story, they're completely set up for a consistent operational model into the hybrid cloud. And these are the sort of investment decisions, right? What's true about today? It's incredibly uncertain, right? We were just talking about schools and things man, it's hard to figure out what's going to happen next month, next week, and it seems to change day by day. So in an uncertain time, you want to make sure that you're buying into an architecture that gives you the flexibility you anticipate you may need.
Cool. And gives you tons of leverage too, because you're starting with something known in most cases, right?
And a career bump for our managers, right? vSphere administrators can now be a cloud administrator, a Kubernetes administrator, an AI facilitator. It's awesome.
Yeah. Lee, awesome. I have one question on this. When we're talking about cost and operating this environment now, You actually see this need of expensing it versus purchasing and amortizing. How are we doing with regards to being able to make this affordable in chunks, whether it's subscription or SaaS service? Is VMware getting to the point where, one of the things I like about AWS and the clouds is I just, I have to pay for what I'm going to use next month. I don't have to buy a 3-year big enterprise deal to make this happen. How are we responding in this space?
Yeah, huge initiative for us to make sure that we're providing competitive operational leverage, if you will. And so you'll see more from us, coming up just shortly, right, on how we're making it flexible for customers to deploy on the location they want. That's important. And to get an operating model, right, that allows their flexibility. Now, I will point out, though, it's not a one-size-fits-all model, right? If you know that you're going to use something and you want a predictable plan, and listen, some funding models where people are very sensitive to OpEx and actually not as sensitive to CapEx.
Interesting.
And so in those models, right? And, at the end of the day, you also, depending on your, it turns out interest rates are relatively low right now, right? And so, as you look and think about the investments you want to make, we certainly have customers that are doing both. And I do know for a fact, right, some of the cloud companies are doing exactly the opposite. They're trying to package up their things to put them into more like a perpetual license model so that customers aren't surprised, right? Because that flexibility can lead you to some interesting surprises. So what I'll say is, we are intent on making sure that customers have complete flexibility from us to deploy and consume on the choice that they prefer.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I was going to say, it just reminds me, we've made great headway in just augmenting the perpetual license offerings we had with offering SaaS, but also subscription, even for the things that are on premise. So I think we've given that all fits with this idea of choice. It's not just the technology, but it's also everything else that comes with it, including the licensing mechanisms as well.
Right.
So it's all great. This has been a great catch up, Lee, on just sort of, the state of the world as it relates to VMware Cloud Foundation and sort of all the innovation that's happening there, both from a technology and also licensing standpoint. Eric, you have any additional questions? And, maybe then we'll move to how folks can learn more and what you're up to next, Lee.
No, go ahead, Lee. We can. It's going to be a fun 2021. I got to get used to saying 2021 here as we come back out of COVID.
Right.
I think there's always for me for wrap up questions. Where do you think as we come out of COVID and the operations model adjusts back to the pendulum is clearly swung to digital and everything from your home. There is no going into the data center. Do you see stuff coming back, or are we kind of pegged to this accelerate the journey? I guess, what do you think of the coming out of COVID and where did we land here?
Well, there's no question in my mind, right, that COVID made it harder to access a data center. And you can see that in some of the products that we offer where, some that can be added into existing environments where it actually continued at pace. And then some that required more kind of, I think there was a little bit of a pause, right? And some things that required more of a active, let's call it modernization effort. But I think that the pace of application change is what's going to drive the next piece, right? And so there's also one other aspect to think. Most of our customers are going to be multi-cloud. Right. And you can't really afford it turns out like the cloud's tools are different right across each one of those. And so if you want to set up like an independent team for every cloud and have an on-prem, all of a sudden it becomes really problematic to think of how you're going to scale that. And this is where the value that we have, right, is to say, well, listen, let's think about the applications that you might want to deploy and then kind of come back into it and say, how might you do that in a way that consolidates the operating time and skills that you require. And then you can come back and say, listen, what I really want to do is I want to make sure a couple of things are not lost in any of this. I don't want to lose uptime. I don't want to lose security. I don't want to include management, right? Consistent across scale. And I don't want to like isolate my existing skill base These are the sort of decisions that lead you to believe, like, how do I get to a full stack answer, right? That's going to respond quickly enough to the apps.
It's nice. Cool. Well, I got to say this from this podcast. One of my big takeaways here, and I'm going to start using this when I talk to people. My favorite family vacation is when I pile everybody in the minivan. I have 4 kids, or I had. Now I'm getting older here, and we would drive up and down California coast, right? And why? Because I own the minivan. It's super efficient to own the minivan, right, and drive it around because you don't have to. You own it. You've already amortized it. It's a great thing. When we fly to New York and have a family vacation, we don't buy the minivan. It's expensive. We do it. It's a different workload. And I can see that analogy here when I'm considering cloud and when I'm considering workloads. I got to look at the whole economic piece of it. I like the idea of you own some components of it, because on those high volume things, you don't want to get the $15 million bill from Amazon at the end of the quarter because we have a high volume app that went crazy for the quarter. And so that's the analogy of the minivan. It's the rental car versus, owning it, right? So thank you for that. That's a great analogy that I'll try to pass on to people, which is because everybody wrestles with the multi-cloud and where does it make sense and how do I manage that? Now we got Kubernetes, the applications layering in. How am I determining where to go, where that line is? And certainly high volume applications and things that you want to own because there are things that you're going to be using up for a long time and you can get that value out of it versus the rapid project that spins up for a year and then goes away. This is an opportunity to take advantage of, but then yet having a common highway system that allows whichever I use, I can still drive the car around the freeways and not worry about it. And for me, that's VMware and the stack that enables this. So.
Yeah, and I just have one comment to add because I think there was another thing you said, Lee, that I just really resonated, which is the uncertainty issue, right? Which is providing a way to deal with uncertainty, so that if you make certain decisions. You still have all your options open in the future. You haven't cut off anything, right? So that's pretty awesome as well in terms of how VMware is approaching providing a platform that works today, but also allows people to deal with the uncertainty and the massive amount of uncertainty around what tomorrow looks like. It's awesome. Good stuff.
Okay, how do we follow you, Lee? And where are good places to go follow up with kind of the VMware's cloud offerings?
Yeah, great. Well, you can certainly follow me personally at Lee Caswell, one word, and on Twitter, and you'll find the newest things coming up on the VMware Cloud Foundation, our vSphere, vSAN work we're doing at NVIDIA, some things that are happening around, new Kubernetes and Tanzu applications. Also, from our website, right, all of the materials around VMware Cloud Foundation, you'll find some terrific things that go down either specific to the application from a technical marketing team led by Wei Gohei, or you'll find even on the positioning side of like, how do we go and take things like our newest application bases? Sheldon DePava runs a team doing all of the product marketing around that. And so you'll find that there's really great assets to help you learn more, right, as you go figure out how to go and get deployed, how to get started on this, and leverage what you already know today because of your investment in vSphere.
All right, so we should spell at Lee Caswell, LeeCaswell. Perfect. Give him a follow on Twitter.
All right. Hey, it's been great having you, Lee. Thanks so much for coming today.
David and Eric, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to see you both, and thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.